So this is our start of our next kind of unit, and we start with chapter 10. This is your endocrine system, which includes all hormones and glands. So it's its own body system, and it has to do with all of your hormones and glands that produce different hormones. These hormones are responsible for growth, puberty, really any sort of homeostasis or body maintenance is the control of your endocrine system. So these are some of the glands that will secrete some of the hormones in your endocrine system. We'll go through all of these in detail, but here's where they're located throughout the body. The pineal gland and pituitary are located in the brain. The thyroid and parathyroid are located kind of on top of each other. The parathyroid glands are these four kind of pink circles. The thymus is in the mediastinum, the central cavity where your heart is located. We have your adrenal glands on top of your kidneys. The pancreas is an endocrine and an exocrine gland, and the hormones that it'll secrete have to do with blood sugar. And then ovaries and testes will both secrete important hormones, male or female. So cell secretion types. These secretions by yourselves can be autocrine or paracrine. And the word autocrine means that they're released by cells and have a local effect on the same type of cell. Paracrine secretions are released by cells that affect other cell types in close proximity. So that's kind of the difference between those two cell secretion types. Neurotransmitters and neuromodulators are secreted by nerve cells, like acetylcholine. So these will be things that affect maintenance of the nervous system. And hormones and neurohormones are secreted into the blood and will bind to receptors. And examples of those are epinephrine and insulin. So here are general functions of the endocrine system. It helps with metabolism, so how quickly you break down a bite of food and either store it as fat or use it as energy. Control of food intake, digestion, so regulating how hungry you feel. Tissue development, ion regulation, water balance, especially in your kidneys. You have different hormones that will affect how much your kidneys retain water or excrete water. So urine output, blood volume. More functions, heart rate and blood pressure regulation, control of blood glucose and other nutrients. So insulin is a big one here that helps to control your blood glucose levels. Control of reproductive functions, uterine contraction, milk release, and immune system regulation. So a lot of functions of your endocrine system. Characteristics, the endocrine system is composed of those endocrine glands we saw and also specialized endocrine cells. I'm thinking specifically of specific endocrine cells in your pancreas. Endocrine glands and cells will secrete minute amounts of chemical messengers called hormones that will be secreted directly into the bloodstream rather than into a duct. So exocrine glands secrete their substances into a duct like a sweat gland or a salivary gland, but endocrine glands secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. The hormones will travel through the blood circulation to their target tissues or effectors. So whether that's a different cell in a different type of the body or anywhere else that it needs to have its effect on. The target tissues have receptors for that specific hormone, and the hormones produce a particular response in the target tissue. We have water-soluble or lipid-soluble hormones, whether they're able to dissolve in water or not. Your water-soluble hormones are the most common, your proteins, peptides, amino acids. And some examples of these are shown here, the growth hormone, antidiuretic hormone, prolactin. We'll go over all of these hormones as well. And then these are examples of lipid-soluble hormones include your steroids and eicosanoids. Luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, that's LH and FSH, as well as androgens, which are some of your sex hormones produced by the gonads. So control of hormone release. The control of hormones, because they have a really important function and a really powerful effect, their control is very specific. Blood-borne chemicals can directly stimulate the release of some hormones, and these chemicals are referred to as humoral stimuli because they will circulate in the blood. Humoral will refer to body fluids like your blood, and the hormone release can also be under neural control from the nervous system. How that works is following any sort of action potential, the neurons will release the neurotransmitter into a synapse with the cells that will produce that hormone. So that's how your nervous system can control the hormone control. Hormone release can also be controlled by other hormones. It occurs when a hormone is secreted that in turn will stimulate the secretion of other hormones. So what that is saying is just that one hormone, when it's secreted, will control the release of another hormone. And the same three types of stimuli, whether it's humoral, neural, or hormonal, can stimulate or inhibit hormone release. So big picture, your endocrine system is highly intricate and very complex, but it has the ability to be controlled extremely easily. So this is a look at if there's low blood calcium in the blood, the endocrine cell, when the blood calcium is too low, that'll be a stimulus that tells your parathyroid hormone to be released. What parathyroid hormone does is actually acts on it tells your osteoclasts to break down bone. Remember, osteoclasts kill bone. And when bone is broken down, it releases excess calcium that was stored in the bone and puts that into the bloodstream. If the calcium in blood is too high, parathyroid hormone secretion will be inhibited. So it will not tell your osteoclasts to break down bone, and it will start to decrease blood calcium levels. So that's just one example of humoral regulation. Neural regulation, this is showing how an action potential in a neuron will innervate an endocrine cell, and it'll stimulate secretion of a stimulatory neurotransmitter. The endocrine cell will then secrete its hormone into the blood where it will travel to its target. So this is an example how a neuron can control hormone secretion from this endocrine cell. And then hormonal regulation. This is showing how one hormone can stimulate another hormone to be released. And this is really common in the hypothalamus and the posterior anterior pituitary. Neurons in your hypothalamus will release what we call stimulatory hormones called releasing hormones. And they'll often be labeled with letters RH at the end, which stands for a releasing hormone that's coming from the hypothalamus to act on the anterior pituitary. These releasing hormones will stimulate the release of a different hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, which travels in the blood to their target endocrine cell. From there, the target endocrine cell will secrete its hormone into the blood, where it travels to its target and produces its response. So we have this kind of multi-level control of different hormones being secreted, and it all starts with the release of a releasing hormone. I should say here, this pituitary gland, we divide it into an anterior and a posterior half, and different hormones are released from either half. Inhibition of hormone release. Humoral inhibition of hormone release generally involves the actions of a companion hormone. Usually each of the companion hormones performs an opposite function. For example, to raise blood pressure, your adrenal cortex will secrete aldosterone in response to low blood pressure. But to lower it, the heart atria will secrete atrial natriuretic peptide. So these two hormones, ANP, it's sometimes labeled, and aldosterone, they work together to maintain the homeostasis of blood pressure. So these are called companion hormones. They have opposite function, and they work together to maintain homeostasis, in this case of blood pressure, but it can be applied to other maintenance of the body too. Neurons could inhibit their targets just as often as they stimulate them. If the neurotransmitter is what we call an inhibitory neurotransmitter, the target endocrine gland does not secrete its hormone. In control of the hormone released by other hormones, some hormones will be inhibitory, that will reduce the release of the hormone being controlled. And a good example of this are your thyroid hormones. They can control their own blood levels by inhibiting their anterior pituitary tropic hormone. And I think we talk about that right here with negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. So two main mechanisms we use to maintain hormone levels in the blood are negative feedback and positive feedback. I think we've talked a little bit about this before. Most hormones are regulated by negative feedback mechanisms. That just means that when a hormone's levels get to be at a certain point, they'll go up and tell the brain, you can shut us off now because there's enough of us in the blood. So the hormone secretion will be inhibited by the hormone itself once its blood levels have reached a certain point. Some hormones are regulated by positive feedback. As an example of that is the tropic hormone action. So a positive feedback, good example will be in uterine contractions. The hormone will continue to be released until the birth of a child. So that's a positive feedback. And here's so showing a negative feedback and positive feedback by hormones. Again, the negative feedback loop, it's basically just telling that once hormone levels have reached their appropriate levels in the blood, that will send a signal to either the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary to cut off. You don't need to make any more of us. There's plenty of us in the blood. Whereas a positive feedback mechanism loop, the hormone from the target endocrine cell will travel to its target, and it has a positive feedback on the effect. So it'll tell your anterior pituitary and your hypothalamus to continue secreting it until some sort of end goal is reached, in the example of a child being born. So we talk a lot, and then we'll talk through the hormones and kind of what they each do. The hormone receptors, a hormone can stimulate only a cell that has the receptor for that hormone. And that's good. So hormones can only stimulate cells that have receptors for them. The portion of each receptor molecule where a hormone binds is called the receptor site. And it has specificity, allowing only one hormone at a time to bind to it. Such hormones, such as epinephrine, can bind to a family of receptors that are structurally similar to it. Epinephrine is one of your stress response hormones that helps initiate the stress response. So that's epinephrine. This specificity is due to molecular shape and chemical characteristics. Lipid and water-soluble hormones will bind to their own classes of receptors. A lipid-soluble hormone will bind to nuclear receptors due to their lipid solubility and small molecular size, allowing them to easily pass through the cell membrane. And water-soluble hormones will bind to membrane-bound receptors. Water-soluble hormones are polar molecules and cannot pass through the cell membrane. More talk about lipid-soluble hormones. I'm just going to see how much, this is just, so we're going to eventually get to target tissues and some pictures, so I can show you some pictures soon. So lipid-soluble hormone receptors will bind to nuclear receptors. I think, is this just a preview of what we just, no, it's a little different. I think I'm just going to skip over these two slides and go right to target tissue. Okay, 1 second. So whenever the chat comes up, I try to read them quick. Target tissue specificity. So this just shows how the target tissue will have a specific receptor that will bind to the specific hormone that's designed for it. So everything will have a specific shape and characteristic for the target tissue specificity. So again, showing how the endocrine system is very specific and highly controlled. Here is the nuclear and membrane bound receptors. So different hormones can get into the nucleus by binding to receptors within the nucleus. So again, just different receptors as part of the nuclear membrane and the nucleus itself. The action of nuclear receptors, lipid-soluble hormones will stimulate protein synthesis. And remember that protein synthesis has to go back to that whole big discussion on DNA to RNA to proteins being made. So this will occur within the nucleus. So that's where nuclear receptors comes in. Lipid-soluble hormones will diffuse across the cell membrane and bind to receptors with the complex now binding to hormone response elements on DNA. This action will regulate the transcription of specific messenger ribonucleic acid molecules, and protein synthesis will occur. So what this is just saying is that your lipid-soluble hormones are responsible for protein synthesis, and they do that by binding to specific receptors on DNA. So this is a look at the nuclear receptor model and how lipid-soluble hormones will diffuse through the cell membrane. They'll bind to either cytoplasmic receptors and travel to the nucleus, or bind to receptors within the nucleus. And then we'll just start the complex of stimulating the DNA to create RNA and to code for specific proteins. So this is all the role of a lipid-soluble hormone. Membrane receptor actions. Membrane receptors act in two ways. They will either alter the activity of what we call G proteins on the inner surface of the cell membrane, or directly alter the activity of intracellular enzymes. When we activate these G proteins, this will elicit or start a specific response in cells, including the production of what we call second messenger molecules. A second messenger molecule is produced inside the cell once a ligand binds to its membrane-bound receptor, and a second messenger, such as cyclic adenosine monophosphate, we sometimes just say it's cyclic AMP, will then activate specific cellular processes inside the cell in response to the hormone. If you go on and take more anatomy and physiology, you'll hear a lot about cyclic AMP. It's just one of the body's most important second messengers. So it's kind of, think of the cyclic AMP as a mediator between two pieces of the puzzle. G protein activation, many membrane-bound receptors will produce responses through the action of G proteins. And G proteins have three kind of pieces to them, and we call those three subunits. The G proteins are named because one of the subunits binds to guanine nucleotides. G proteins, after several sequential actions, will interact with adenylate cyclase, an enzyme that converts ATP to cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP binds to protein kinases and activate them. So I just want to show you a picture of this. We'll talk last slide. Protein kinases are enzymes that will regulate the activity of other enzymes, and protein kinases can increase or decrease activity. Phosphodiesterase will break down cyclic AMP and thus result in no further cell stimulation. So what we're talking here, again, is how a water-soluble hormone, so we talked about lipid-soluble hormones, can cross the cell membrane because they're made of lipids. Remember, your cell membranes are made of lipids, so only lipid-soluble hormones can cross them. So lipid-soluble hormones can get through the cell membrane, can get into the nucleus and stimulate protein synthesis. Water-soluble hormones cannot get through the cell membrane because they're water-based or polar, so they'll bind to receptors. This G protein subunit will then bind to that receptor, and we'll begin this whole kind of second messenger cyclic AMP activation, which will eventually send on the signal to the inside of the cell that that hormone wanted to elicit the response. So we have a hormone that's water soluble, it can't get into the cell, so we go through G protein units and also cyclic AMP to elicit the response from that intended hormone inside the cell. Here's cyclic AMP synthesis. It's just showing how cyclic AMP will be formed and then how it's broken down. Phosphodiesterase will inactivate cyclic AMP later so that the cell isn't constantly being stimulated by this hormone that's bound to its receptor. So everything is highly controlled within the cell and how that hormone will affect it. Signal amplification. Hormones that stimulate the synthesis of those second messengers like cyclic AMP will act quickly and have an amplification effect where each receptor will produce thousands of second messengers, leading to a cascade effect, and will ultimately amplify or make that hormone signal much larger. With amplification, a single hormone can activate many second messengers, each of which will activate enzymes that produce an enormous amount of final product. And the efficiency of this second messenger amplification is virtually unparalleled in the body. And that's why your hormones have such an incredible effect on all parts of the body, because one single hormone can activate many of these second messengers, which will go on and produce an enormous amount of final product. So this just explains that sort of cascade effect from one hormone binding to one receptor. It'll activate G proteins. That will activate cyclic or the adenylate cyclase, which will then be formed into cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP, the second messenger, will go on to activate protein kinase enzymes, which will have an effect virtually unparalleled throughout the body. Okay, so we'll stop talking about kind of how hormones are able to be activated, inactivated, and now we'll talk about the different types of hormones in the body. The pituitary gland is the small gland in the brain. It's controlled by your hypothalamus, and we divide it into an anterior and a posterior region. It secretes at least 6 hormones. Here's your pituitary gland. You can see here how we divide it into the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary is shown here. The anterior pituitary is connected via blood vessels. The posterior pituitary is not, and we'll talk about how it's controlled. There's just 2 hormones that come off of the posterior pituitary. Your antidiuretic hormone, which will act on your kidneys to regulate water fluid levels, and oxytocin, which acts on the uterus and mammary glands. Then there are 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, if you count the gonadotropic hormones. These come out of the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone is really prominent during puberty. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotropic hormones are FSH and LH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and prolactin. And we'll go over what each of those hormones do, I think pretty much right now, after we talk a little bit more about the anterior pituitary gland actions themselves. The anterior pituitary gland synthesizes hormones that is under the control of the hypothalamus. So your anterior pituitary gland creates its own hormones, but the hypothalamus controls when they'll be released. The hypothalamus will secrete releasing hormones that will stimulate the production and the secretion of a specific hormone, and an inhibiting hormone will decrease the secretion of a specific pituitary hormone. So here's a look at how the hypothalamus will control the secretion and stimulation of anterior pituitary hormones, because it'll control posterior pituitary gland hormones are controlled a little differently. So any sort of stimulus from the nervous system will act on hypothalamic neurons to secrete any sort of releasing hormones or inhibiting hormone. They will leave the capillaries and they will stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary cells. In response to releasing hormones, the anterior pituitary hormones, which are the little yellow squares, will travel through the blood to their target tissues, shown by the green arrow, which in some cases are other endocrine glands. So the growth hormone is, we're going to start going through these hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary gland. The growth hormone, the target tissues are just most of your bone cells, cartilage, anything that needs to grow during puberty, growth hormone will mostly have an effect on it. The functions of growth hormone are to stimulate the growth of bones, muscles, organs. Our abnormalities associated with growth hormone, if we have too much growth hormone secretion, that'll cause a problem called gigantism. There's a G that's missing here and an A, gigantism. If that happens in children, it'll cause the children to be much larger and taller than normal. If it happens in adults, too much growth hormone can affect how your hands would kind of look really swollen and your neck would kind of get really big. Too little growth hormone would cause pituitary dwarfism. So there's different types of dwarfism, which are in adults being very short for an adult, but too little growth hormone, we would call it pituitary dwarfism because it's a problem with the pituitary gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also from the anterior pituitary. The target tissue of this is your thyroid gland, which is around your larynx or your voice box. And the functions of TSH is to regulate thyroid gland secretions. So if we have too much thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland will enlarge, and that can be seen through the neck, and we call that a goiter. Usually that has to do, we call that hyperthyroidism, because too much TSH will tell your thyroid gland to stimulate too many thyroid hormones, and that causes your thyroid gland to enlarge, and we call that a goiter. Too little TSH, the thyroid gland will actually shrink, and it's not secreting enough thyroid hormones, and we call that hypothyroidism. So here's the regulation of thyroid hormone secretion. I wish I had this drawn out for you, but if you're confused about kind of where these hormones are coming from, and if it's getting kind of confusing, I like to make flow charts on a piece of paper to show where the hormone is coming from and what's being released. So for example, and I'm just drawing something quick out here, you might not be able to even see this. So I don't even know that this isn't going to work because I have a background in. So basically, if you draw out some sort of flow chart and you put your hypothalamus in a box, and then an arrow coming off of the hypothalamus would be a releasing hormone, such as thyrotropin releasing hormone. The hypothalamus releases TRH to stimulate the release of TSH from your anterior pituitary gland. TSH then will act on the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. And your thyroid hormones have been abbreviated T3 and T4 for you. There's two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. One is inactive and one is the active form, and they just help control how much thyroid hormone is there in the body. So your thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, are really important in increasing metabolism, increasing body temperature, and increasing normal growth and development. So if you have someone who is hyperthyroid, they have too many T3 and T4 thyroid hormones. Hyperthyroidism will increase the size of the thyroid gland, and we call that a goiter. You can sometimes see that on the neck as a physical indication that something's wrong with the thyroid. It will also increase metabolism. So people with hyperthyroidism are sometimes very thin. And if hyperthyroidism gets too severe, we call that Graves' disease. So their metabolism is working on overdrive. Their heart could be fluttering. We call those heart palpitations. Increased body temperature. They're hot all the time, basically because their body is just constantly using up energy and breaking it down. What would someone who has hypothyroidism, if they have too little thyroid hormones, what kind of things would be going on with them?
You said hypothyroid?
Hypo, yeah, hypo.
So their thyroid is actually slow. So therefore they could be gaining weight or having any.
Yeah, so basically decreased metabolism. They're cold all the time. Yeah, hypothyroidism. These two disorders often affect women. So just keep that in mind. They can also maybe be hereditary, run in the family.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have two friends, and one is hypo and one is hyper, and they both have to take medication. The one that has hypo actually got it removed, and the one that has hyper, she still has it with a bunch of knots in the back of her throat. But can they both, if they don't take the medication, can both of them have their organs shut down?
I think of organs shutting down, I mean, eventually it would just be really hard for them to function because the thyroid hormones do so much, like control metabolism, body temperature, growth. So I don't know if it would specifically shut down their hormones, but it would significantly impact the processes of their body. I'm interested, you said the hypothyroid friend got it removed?
Yes.
So she probably just takes synthetic hormones?
Yes. And then the one that has hyper, she's on medication, but she gets really sick all the time. And she was the one that was telling me if she doesn't take it, they told her all her organs were going to be shutting down. Like she could die from that.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, yeah, she would probably get way too uncomfortable before that happens. But yeah, if she stops taking it, she'll get extremely uncomfortable. And then, I mean, eventually she'd probably want to keep taking it to control those levels. Yeah. Yeah, it's real. And they're both females, I'm assuming, Jen.
Sounds like the immune system is like shot to crap. But I mean, like the way that we got taught in the military is like your body's like an engine, right? So like, let's say if your transmission starts acting up, everything, even if it's functioning, but has a deficiency, everything else is going to have to compensate for that deficiency. So eventually something is bound to happen, you know? So that's just how the body functions. You know, they try to compensate and it just, everything else gets overworked and then eventually it's going to give up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, I like that to use the example of polio. So polio just breaks down your nervous system, but do you die from your nerves breaking down? No, you die from, you suffocate because your diaphragm can't breathe anymore. So yeah, everything's kind of tied together. And yeah, tell your friend to keep taking it. I have one of my neighbors, a really good friend, has Graves' disease, and she doesn't like taking any sort of medication. So she tries to manage it with her diet, and she does an okay job. So if your friend doesn't like taking medication, but I worry about her because I think you just really have to be careful. Yeah, so it affects the females more. I don't know why. Probably because we just have more hormonal stuff going on anyway. All right, more anterior pituitary. We'll keep getting through these, but yeah, feel free to chime in if you have know of anyone with disorders. Gonadotropin hormones are the hormones that will affect the gonads. So females, males, the target tissues will be your ovaries or your testes. Luteinizing hormone, the function of LH is to promote ovulation and progesterone production. So luteinizing hormone, this will kind of peak right before a woman ovulates or releases an egg into her reproductive tract to hopefully, in the hopes of it getting fertilized, if that's the goal. Progesterone is released in hopes, if there is, it's kind of to get the uterus ready for a pregnancy if that egg is fertilized. Luteinizing hormone for males, the function of luteinizing hormone in males is to function in sperm production and also testosterone. Kelp powder. Thanks, Cecile. And ask my friend about that, my neighbor. I bet she knows all about that too. Gonadotropin hormone number 2 is follicle stimulating hormone. And follicle stimulating hormone just stimulates follicle production. And the follicles in females are eggs and in males are sperm. So the target tissue will be the follicles in the ovaries. So in your ovaries, females, all of your eggs are kind of stopped as follicles. And follicle stimulating hormone will turn those follicles into mature eggs and will also help in estrogen secretion. Kind of the same thing in males. It'll act on the seminiferous tubules, which are tons of tiny little tubules in the testes, which help to produce sperm. So that's follicle stimulating hormone, helps to stimulate follicles, eggs, or sperm. Prolactin. So again, these are all hormones coming off of the anterior pituitary. Prolactins target, yeah.
Professor, sorry, I got a question that I have no idea of. What do you mean by the egg matures?
So in females are born with only a certain number of follicles, which will go on and mature to be eggs. So within the ovaries, we females actually, when you're developing in your mother's womb, so as a fetus, the female fetus has a finite number of eggs in their ovaries. And I think it's 1.5 million. And they're arrested in stage 1 development. So they're not completely eggs yet. They're just kind of stopped in the pre-egg stage. And follicle stimulating hormone will then go on and tell the egg, okay, egg, you can get ready to mature and we'll get ready to release you soon. So follicle stimulating hormone basically matures those follicles to become eggs. And luteinizing hormone then tells the mature egg, okay, you can release now. And women who are trying to get pregnant can actually monitor their LH levels and test those hormone levels, because they know that once they see kind of an upswing in luteinizing hormone, they know they're going to release an egg soon.
So what's the point of menopause then?
You, as a male, you have all the female questions, Ray. This is
I'm not a
menopause.
Girl. I want to know.
So menopause, there's a couple of things that happen in menopause. So eventually those finite number of eggs run out. And once you start to get near the end of your eggs, menopause will occur. Other things occur in the body just to kind of not shut down the female reproductive system, but kind of, in my mind, to save the female from having kids forever, because I think if mom had had kids forever, we would just die sooner because kids
So-
are so much work. But
So definitely a
just menopause
survival.
is just kind of
Survival?
well, yeah, but menopause is just your hormone levels all change in menopause as a female, and that stops eggs from being released. All hormone levels change in menopause. Also, your calcium levels can be affected, osteoporosis. So women kind of have a lot to go through. 40s, 50s. Good questions. Along that, with females, males are probably like, we get the short end of the stick. There's nothing that happens with us. But prolactin target tissues are mammary glands and ovaries. And the function is to stimulate milk production and also uterine contraction. So this is prolactin, not uterine contraction, excuse me. Prolactin is just stimulating milk production from the mammary glands. If you think about that idea of survival of the fittest, how every organism on Earth is wants to like reproduce, you can think about a lot of these hormones then will be designed as kind of as an action to help the egg and the sperm, or to help start secreting milk, you know, as food for a baby that were to come out. The next two, melanocyte stimulating hormone, this one is not always covered in the anterior pituitary, but this one will affect melanocytes in the skin to stimulate melanin production. And melanin works to protect your skin from UV rays. Then adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, will act on the cells of your adrenal cortex, which are just, the adrenal cortex is the outer layer of your adrenal glands, and they're on top of your kidneys. And this will stimulate the production of certain corticosteroids, which are some of your adrenaline response or stress hormones. Okay, the posterior pituitary actions then. We have just two hormones from your posterior pituitary gland. We have antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone targets your kidneys to help conserve water. So if you take a diuretic medication, that means it's going to make you urinate a lot. Antidiuretic hormone tries to conserve water or retain water. So it tells your kidneys to keep more water in the body, so you'll pee out less. And abnormalities with antidiuretic hormone is a type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus. It has nothing to do with blood sugar, but it has some of the same diagnostic characteristics that people with diabetes mellitus have. And it basically, the abnormality is that you have too little or too few antidiuretic hormones. So your kidneys are not conserving and retaining water. They're producing large amounts of watery urine. So these people will urinate frequently, and this can lead to dehydration and thirst. There's a little girl, not little, but when I was in grade school, she had diabetes insipidus. So this kind of large amounts of urine. This frequent urination is also a common sign of diabetes mellitus. And diabetes mellitus is the type 1 and type 2 that we're maybe more familiar with. Diabetes insipidus just means there's too little ADH in the body, so the kidneys are producing way too much urine. Oxytocin then, target tissues of the uterus. Question? No question. All right, so oxytocin then targets the uterus, and its function is to increase uterine contractions during labor. So oxytocin is a great example of a positive feedback loop. Oxytocin is continually being released until the birth of a baby, and then that will shut off the oxytocin release. So here's how the hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary. It's not through the bloodstream, it's through what the nervous system. So stimuli within the nervous system causes hypothalamic neurons to increase or decrease their action potential frequency. These action potentials are conducted by axons of the hypothalamic neurons through what we call the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. That's a really long word there. I should teach my daughter that. She's learning syllables in kindergarten. I don't even know how many syllables will that, but a really long word. So what this is just a tract of nervous control that controls the secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. the thyroid gland. So now we're going to go through some of the glands of the body. If we can't get through all of them, I'll add them to the next lecture that I post, because we're getting to a lot of information, I know. So your thyroid gland is one of the largest. It requires iodine to function. So this is why, back in the 40s, they added iodine to salt. So you can buy iodized salt at the grocery store or non-iodized salt. One isn't really better than the other, but your thyroid gland requires iodine to function. It will secrete thyroid hormone and calcitonin. Thyroid hormones are secreted by follicular cells that the target tissue is most tissue again, because your thyroid hormones are responsible for a lot of different things in the body. They regulate metabolic rates, which is needed for growth. Calcitonin is secreted by what we call parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. Calcitonin targets bone and some other tissues to reduce blood calcium level when it's too high. So if you can remember, calcitonin tones down, the toning down of blood calcium levels. Basically, calcitonin takes calcium out of the blood when the level is too high and stores it in your bone. So calcitonin tones down blood calcium levels. Then we have our disorders, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism that we kind of talked about. They all have to do with hypo means too little or below. So below normal thyroid hormone levels. Hyperthyroidism, above normal, too many thyroid hormones. So hypothyroidism, everything is slowed down. Decreased metabolism, weight gain, reduced appetite, fatigue, low temperature, low pulse. It affects your heart rate. It slows down your heart. So Jen, I'm thinking of your friend. I mean, eventually the heart would stop beating, but that person would get very, well, she was hyperthyroid, but either way, it will directly affect the organs. Dry and cold skin hypothyroidism. Again, everything is kind of slowed down. Myasthenia in adults has to do with swelling of the muscles. Creatism in infants has to do with increased protein levels. Hyperthyroidism, increased metabolism, weight loss. So hyperthyroidism is everything is sped up then. So the metabolism is going too fast. So you're losing weight, you're eating, you're nervous all the time, your heart is beating uncontrollably from your chest, higher temperature, higher pulse rate, warm, flushed skin. And eventually, if it becomes severe enough, we call hyperthyroidism Graves' disease. It will lead to a goiter because the hypothyroid is producing so many thyroid hormones. It's like an overdrive, and you'll see that goiter sticking out of someone's neck. Parathyroid hormone is released from the parathyroid gland. It targets bones and kidneys, and parathyroid hormone is the opposite of calcitonin. So it will regulate blood calcium levels even more so than calcitonin. Basically, what parathyroid hormone does is it increases blood calcium levels. So if calcium is low, then your osteoclasts will break down bone and release less of it into the urine. And if calcium is too high, then osteoclasts don't break it down. So that's parathyroid hormone. So here's the regulation of blood calcium levels. If anything, if the blood calcium levels are too high or too low, blood calcium levels increase, receptors will take that, parathyroid hormone gland secretion decreases, whereas if blood calcium levels are decreased, parathyroid gland secretions will increase. So just if you can remember that parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels, so it'll tell your osteoclasts to break down bone and put calcium from the bone into the blood. And calcitonin does the opposite effect. It tones down blood calcium levels. It'll take calcium out of the blood and store it in bone. Parathyroid hormone also controls the amounts of blood calcium levels if they are to increase, because parathyroid hormone stimulation will just be inhibited or turned off. Here's the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands, just where they're located. So here's your thyroid gland. It sits right underneath your larynx. And if you don't know where your larynx is, you can feel where your Adam's apple is. That's this kind of laryngeal prominence you feel. And the thyroid gland will be right below that. And your parathyroid hormones or parathyroid glands are these small little yellow circles located on the back of the thyroid gland. And this is a look at some of the thyroid cells. So the adrenal gland then, these are two small glands located superior to each kidney. The inner part of the gland is called the medulla, and the outer part is called the cortex. The medulla and the cortex will function as completely separate endocrine glands, so they'll just secrete different things. So here's where the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys, and here's a look. The cortex is this yellowish outer layer of the adrenal glands, and the medulla is the inner kind of brown layer. The adrenal medulla hormones will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will be released as part of the fight or flight response. So this is a little bit under sympathetic nervous system control. And because this is our fight or flight response, it'll increase heart rate, dilate your blood vessels, release energy stores from your liver and fat cells. So everything to get ready to use energy and to fight or flight. So here's the regulation of that and how just different kind of factors will increase secretion of norepinephrine or epinephrine. So physical activity, low blood glucose levels. So if your blood glucose levels are too low, norepinephrine and epinephrine will go to your liver and your fatty storages and take out glucose from the storage and put it in the blood. And any sort of other stress response, it'll tell your norepinephrine and epinephrine to kind of do these things shown in this pink box to get everything ready for kind of an adrenaline response. The adrenal cortex hormone is aldosterone. It's a mineral corticoid, which it's that type of hormone. It'll function to target your kidneys. And aldosterone causes sodium and water to be retained and potassium to be secreted. So what it'll kind of play a role in, it kind of helps with your antidiuretic hormone, but aldosterone specifically retains sodium and water. And when your kidneys retain excess sodium, water will follow that.
Go get it, it's over there.
And you'll increase your blood pressure and blood volume levels. So aldosterone, if you are in some sort of trauma accident and you lose a lot of blood fluid or blood volume, aldosterone will be kicked into gear to try to retain sodium and water to increase blood pressure and blood volume in your body. So here's a look at the regulation of aldosterone. The stimulatory effects are shown with the green arrows. If you have a decreased blood sodium level or increased blood potassium level, aldosterone will come into play to try to retain sodium or excrete potassium. And by retaining sodium in your kidneys, we'll learn about this wherever sodium goes, water just follows. So while the goal of aldosterone might be to decrease might be to increase your blood sodium levels to retain sodium, water will naturally follow that. So you'll retain water as well. Okay, decreased blood pressure also acts on the kidneys to tell renin to constrict your blood vessels, and constricting blood vessels will automatically try to increase your blood pressure as well. Again, this happens if you lose a lot of fluid, you're in some sort of emergency situation, your body kind of goes into emergency mode and tries to retain as much fluid as possible, constrict your blood vessels to increase your blood pressure to try to get the blood where it needs to go in your body. Cortisol is a type of glucocorticoid from the adrenal gland. It functions to increase the breakdown of fat. So this will be a protein for energy use. It will reduce inflammatory and immune responses. But the function of cortisol is to increase the breakdown of fat so you get more energy to be used for either an inflammatory or some sort of immune response. So here's the regulation of cortisol secretion. And this, again, it shows you where the releasing hormone is coming from. The corticotropin releasing hormone is coming from the hypothalamus. It will act on the anterior pituitary to send out adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's another hormone. That will then act on the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And cortisol, again, will increase lipid and protein breakdown. So it basically gets energy available for your body to use. and it usually uses that energy for any sort of anti-inflammatory effect. So if there's some sort of disease in your body or some sort of foreign object gets stuck in your skin, like a splinter or a piece of glass, cortisol will be sent to get energy required for any sort of anti-inflammatory effects for that. How are you guys doing so far? Just put in the chat how you're feeling about this information. I know it's a lot. 10, feeling okay. 0, feeling like this is way too much to cover in one lecture. Why didn't you spend 2 days talking about this? But I'm spending 1 because I'm trying to make up for time. Hopefully it's kind of interesting to you guys. I love the endocrine system because you really learn how your body functions. No exams, Brian, but I'll probably cancel class on Tuesday. So look for a lecture posted.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, endocrine system is always tough. It's because it's so much information. It might make more sense than the nervous system, but it's just a lot of like memorizing hormones and what they do. That's the best way I can to describe it. But I try to bring in some clinical aspects to keep it a little interesting. Okay, well, let's keep going here. And I'm going to try to finish out this PowerPoint today. So androgens, androgen means sex hormones. So the target tissue is most because your sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen will affect growth during puberty. Oh, thanks, Vanessa. You guys are so nice to me. Wish I was teaching at Crafton next semester. All right. The functions of your androgens, males has to do with your secondary sexual characteristics. So lowering the voice, growth of facial hair, which happens during puberty, female sex drive. So these are your androgens. And I guess that's all we have on those. All right, then the pancreas. And the pancreas is important because we'll talk a lot about insulin here, and we'll spend some time discussing what diabetes are and the 2 types. Your pancreas is a mixed gland with an exocrine portion and an endocrine portion. And again, the endocrine portion has to do with hormones being secreted directly into the bloodstream. The exocrine portion are digestive enzymes that the pancreas secretes that are released into the small intestine to help with digestion, and that'll occur through ducts. So that's the exocrine portion, your digestive enzymes. The endocrine part will consist of the pancreatic islets, also known as islets of Langerhans. That guy probably found him, whoever he is. Langerhans, is that like, I don't know. They are dispersed throughout the exocrine portion of the pancreas, but your islets will have 3 different cell types, each of which secrete a separate hormone. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, beta cells secrete insulin, and delta cells secrete somatostatin. I do want you to know what each cell secretes because each of these hormones are extremely important. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. Insulin decreases blood glucose levels, and somatostatin is also called growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and it will actually inhibit growth hormone. These 3 hormones will regulate blood vessels of nutrients, blood levels of nutrients, especially glucose. So this just again shows you, so here is the exocrine portion. So you'll see it connected to glands that secrete their enzymes into a duct, and the duct will go on and enter the small intestine, the duodenum here. And within the exocrine portion, we have all these islet cells, and the islets are made up of 3 different types of cells, and each cell type secretes a different hormone. The delta cells secrete somatostatin, alpha cells secrete glucagon, and beta cells will secrete insulin. So insulin, its target tissues are liver, skeletal muscle, and adipose tissue. And that's because insulin decreases blood glucose levels. So what insulin does is it takes excess glucose out of your blood and it'll take it to the liver to be stored, or your muscle to be stored, or adipose tissue to be stored. So that's how insulin lowers blood glucose levels. After you eat, your glucose levels are high from everything you ingested. So insulin will be secreted to take excess glucose out of your bloodstream and store it in your liver, your muscle, or your fat. So this is why if you eat too much fatty food or just eat unhealthy in general, insulin will take that excess glucose and put it in your liver, and your liver might become fatty. And that fatty liver could lead to more liver disease. Extra glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, and glycogen is in your liver. Diabetes mellitus, the causes are too little insulin or fatty insulin receptors. The symptoms are exaggerated appetite, excess urine, dehydration, thirst, and fatigue. So you can see right away how these symptoms, excess urine, dehydration, thirst, they match up with the diabetes insipidus, which was because of too little ADH secretion. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is insulin dependent, so you need daily injections required. So type 1 diabetes is basically when your cells stop producing adequate amounts of insulin. So type 1 diabetes is usually the one that affects kids, or it can sometimes be genetic or hereditary. This is type 1 insulin. It's really not anything that you do. There's many people who are type 1 insulin dependent, and there's nothing they can do to change that. Their cells just don't produce enough insulin, so they have to take a daily insulin injection. Usually it's a pump that goes right into their stomach, their gut. Type 2 insulin independent is often found in obese people. I don't really like the word obese people because it can really affect anyone who leads an unhealthy life, more often in overweight people. It can be treated with diet, but it can turn into type 1 diabetes, which basically the cells are unable to produce sufficient amounts of insulin. Type 2 diabetes, it's usually there's enough insulin secreted, but your cells don't respond to it anymore. So that's the difference between type 1 and type 2. Glucagon, the target tissues are liver, because what glucagon does is it puts more glucose into the blood if levels are too low. So it'll go to the liver and take excess glucose that's being stored there and put it back into the blood. So it functions to regulate your blood glucose levels. It'll come into play between meals when your levels drop. So if you aren't eating adequately or your blood glucose levels are extremely low, glucagon will be secreted to try to increase those blood glucose levels. So glucagon allows glycogen to just be broken down in the liver into glucose. So here's kind of a chart describing these blood glucose levels. I'll have you guys kind of study this on your own and look over it, just to look at how these two hormones, glucagon and insulin, will be stimulated in response to low blood sugar or high blood sugar. The testes hormone is testosterone. The target tissue is most because testosterone will be extremely active during puberty. Testosterone acts on the vocal cords to increase their length during puberty. So this is why males, the voice drops during puberty because of their vocal cords are being acted on from testosterone to grow longer. The functions are also to aid in sperm and reproductive organ development and function. Estrogen and progesterone is also really important for most target tissues, most tissues in the female. It's involved in uterine and mammary gland development and also the menstrual cycle. So progesterone and estrogen, in terms of the menstrual cycle and the uterus, they'll be increased greatly once a month to try to get the uterus ready for implantation of a fertilized egg. The thymosin is a thymus gland hormone, and your thymus gland is important with your immune system. It will promote immune system development as well as function. And we got to be getting close. Just one more slide. Melatonin is secreted from your pineal gland. And the pineal gland, if you remember just where kind of that's located, the pineal gland is located in the brain, kind of way in the back. It will work to target your hypothalamus, to play a role in the onset of puberty and control your circadian rhythm, which is your sleep-wake cycle. Light will affect its function. So if it all of a sudden becomes dark, melatonin will be increased to try to help get your body into kind of this sleep-wake cycle rhythm.